Just want to make sure, can everyone see my screen?
Yes. Welcome to the city of Gloucester. Welcome from the city of Gloucester, or from the city. Okay, Greg, so why don't we were, I don't know who's in control. Taskina, thank you.
Okay, well, welcome everybody to the second public forum on the harbor planning development process, or sorry, the harbor plan development process. And Taskina, if I could just quickly share my screen. I know that's the overall agenda that you can walk through eventually, but I'd just like to put up the agenda for the meeting from the website. So 1 second, and I will share that. And we are pleased that we have, it looks like about 63 attendees. So I really appreciate you following the process. And I think we've done a pretty good job of capturing contacts for folks that have wanted to stay involved and trying to remind you as much as possible, as far in advance as possible, when there is going to be a meeting that also allows the public to engage. Otherwise, the Harbor Plan Committee has continually been kind of meeting along on very specific topic related pieces developed by our consulting team, Util et al. And so again, welcome you this evening, and I'm just going to pass it over to Rick Noonan, the Harbor Plan Committee Chair, to just introduce the meeting, and then we'll get into the rest of the balance of the agenda.
Thank you, Greg. So I'd like to call the meeting of the Harbor Planning Committee public hearing of March 7th to order. Time is 6:05. Pursuant to section 20 of chapter 20 of the Acts of 2021, this meeting will be conducted by remote participation. Additionally, all votes taken by the Harbor Planning Committee during this and future remote meetings will be by roll call vote. If there is a public comment period, and if you're calling in on a phone, you can press *9 to request to speak. If you're watching on a computer or a device, there is a raised hand button that you can tap or press to request to speak. This meeting will be recorded and made available at the city's website in accordance with the state open meeting laws. And by way of introduction of the Harbor Plan Committee, I'd like to recognize Greg Catamatore, who is our planning director for the city of Gloucester, Vito Gigaloni, Tony Gross, former city council member John McCarthy, Al Catone, our staff economic development director for the city of Gloucester, Sal DeStefano, and we've got Tessa Brown, local businesswoman, Gemma Wilkins, who is our staff planner, and Tom Balf, who is a Harbor Planning Committee staff or committee member. So Taskina, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Rick. All right, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Great. All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us on a Monday evening for the public meeting 2 of the Gloucester Municipal Harbor Planning process. So knowing that we have a lot to cover tonight, we want to leave ample room for you all to participate and ask questions. So there will be some simple live polling that we'll be conducting intermittently throughout the presentation. We will also have a Q&A chat open. You should be able to see that active on your screen at the bottom. And then we will also leave room at the end of the presentation for a larger discussion for questions and comments. And as a reminder, I know that at this point, we are all pretty familiar with the Zoom platform, but we kindly ask that everyone is respectful of each other's time and gives everyone an opportunity to participate, especially during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So if you would like to speak, please raise your hand using the raise your hand function. And then please, if you have more than one question, wait until others attending have also had an opportunity to ask a question. And as I mentioned, the Q&A chat will be active throughout the presentation. So if you have any questions or comments that are coming to you as we're presenting, please feel free to submit those directly, and a member of our team will try to respond. And there will also be time at the end for any to address any unanswered question. And then, of course, if you're not comfortable as this being the platform to submit your feedback, please feel free to directly reach out to Gemma Wilkins in that email at the bottom, as well as myself. And you can also submit a question directly from the website. So before we dive into presenting some of the analysis we've been doing of the working waterfront, we just want to give you all a quick update of where we are in the planning process and the engagement we've done to date. So as you can see from the schedule graphic I've put up here, we are about halfway into the planning process, and we're really wrapping up our baseline assessment of the economic conditions and also resiliency strategies for the harbor. And we'll be presenting a lot of those findings tonight for you all. Again, this is just meeting number 2 of the process. So there'll be subsequent other public meetings and more opportunity for you all to continue to provide feedback as we develop plan recommendations. So before we summarize the engagement that we've done to date, we just want to conduct a quick poll to get a better sense of who all is attending here tonight and what your relationship with both this planning process is and also the sort of the study area of the plan. So I think this is, a poll should prompt up to your screen. Please let us know if you can't see it.
And please feel free to check all that apply. So you don't need to choose just one if more than one are true for you. We have just about 75%. Give a few more moments for people to finish up. Okay, looks like we've stabilized, so I'll close it out in 3, 2, 1. And share back the results. So you can see here that we have a lot of folks who are recreational users of the study area features, so like instance, walking, running, biking, boating, being a customer of a business on the harbor. Quite a few current Gloucester residents that live beyond the walking distance to the study area, and some that live within walking distance, and then sort of scattered a few others throughout the other categories. So a couple of property and business owners, a couple of workers, and a few that are none of the above.
Great, thank you, Zoe. So we'll give a quick review of the engagement and outreach that we've conducted so far in the planning process. So we have met with the Harbor Planning Committee about 7 times, where we've reviewed baseline analysis of the waterfront, resilience and economic conditions, and we're also beginning to workshop strategies to meet plan goals. Recordings of each of these meetings and summary notes can all be accessed through the website. We had our public meeting kickoff last November that I hope many of you were able to attend. And during that workshop, we launched the social pinpoint mapping tool. So we had over 551 visits to that site and 67 map comments placed. And then throughout this planning process, we've also reached out to and engaged with over 30 individual and organization stakeholders, and also received direct feedback through the website. And we continue to really encourage everyone to use the website to share feedback throughout this process. So the social pinpoint mapping tool is still active. So for those of you who are not, who didn't get the chance to submit a comment or really didn't get familiar with using the tool, it is still open. You can access it through the front page of the website, and it'll essentially take you to this page that you see here, where you get an opportunity to place a marker indicating what you view as a strength of the harbor, weakness, or opportunities for the harbor. And just to give you a summary of results so far, we've had over 160 unique visitors to the site. And many of those have frequently visited the site. As you can see, the total of over 500 visits, 67 comments placed on the site. Of the comments that were placed, there's even split between weaknesses and harbors and strengths identified for the harbor, but most of the comments were geared towards opportunities for the harbor. As you can see, opportunity is also a key word that kept coming up in the comments. And just from the 67 comments that were placed, we're already starting to see some similar themes emerge. Themes around how do we create connections between downtown and the harbor? What are some opportunities for mixed use development along the harbor? And then, specific flooding concerns, not only for specific areas, but also general resilience of strategies for the harbor as a whole. And these comments are very similar to the comments and feedback that we've also received during our stakeholder outreach. There's been a lot of questions and thought around how do we preserve and the fishing heritage, but also think about Gloucester as a 21st century harbor. Questions about how we, utilize underutilized areas of the harbor, how we think about I4C2, how resiliency should be a central focus for any strategy that we consider. And then thinking about, that relationship between the upland and the harbor. So how, for instance, how can tourism become a part of that equation? So before I hand it over to Matthew to present our next section, we want to take another quick poll, exploring two questions. One is, what is the main thing that you hope to get out of this meeting? And this will really help us make sure that we're making this meeting useful for you and being respectful of your time. And then what are the top issues, concerns, and themes that you would like to see this plan address? And then we can use the comment and question session at the end to address any questions more specific you have to some of these themes.
Okay, so I just launched the poll. You'll see the first one really encourages you to choose just one. So I'm sure many of you are looking to get a couple of different things from this meeting, but we want to kind of hear what your top priority is to hear and learn from us during this meeting. And then for the second question, you'll see that there's a variety of sort of issues, concerns, and themes that we've kind of written out here based on, in large part, what we've heard from our engagement so far. So what Taskina listed in terms of the stakeholder interviews, as well as the social pinpoint and our first public meeting. So you'll see things like water dependent uses, fishing, shell fishing, and seafood processing, blue tech and life sciences and R&D, essential public services and infrastructure investment, development, tourism, and hospitality, public access and wayfinding, resilience, ecology, technical assistance and capacity building, and finally I4C2 and public property development. There's little descriptions associated with each to just give you a sense of kind of what we are talking about. And our hope is that you kind of choose, top three, a couple that you really are top priorities for you that you'd like to see us address in this plan. And we'll give you a little bit of time because these are more complicated questions than the first one. So.
And so I just inform people that they can scroll up on that poll. I don't know if that's intuitive or not. There's no sort of up or down.
Yep. Thanks for that, Rick. Yep. If you're using a mouse, you use the sort of the scroll button. It'll pull you up and down within it. If you're using a trackpad, you can use 2 fingers to slide up or down within the poll.
Yeah, thank you.
We're about halfway in terms of participation, so we'll give people a little bit more time. A little over 2/3 of the way through. Appreciate y'all taking the time to do this. It takes a little bit of thinking, a little bit of focus. Appreciate it. All right, looks like we're plateauing a little bit, so I think I'll go ahead and close out the poll, and certainly feel free to continue providing input. We'll kind of have more opportunities like this to share. This will just give us a sense of where to focus our energies for this meeting. So I'm going to go ahead and close out in 3, 2, 1. And I will share back to you all so you can see where we landed. So a lot of you all are here to just kind of get some general information and awareness of the plan and to hear what others are saying and thinking. And a few of you are coming with a specific sort of advocacy lens for either a specific issue or approach or a specific sort of physical, site within the harbor that you're looking to kind of advocate for. So that's great. Looking forward to hearing from you all. And then for the second question, for top issues, it looks like the one that had the most interest was fishing, shell fishing, and seafood processing, which should come as no surprise. And then a lot of interest in water dependent uses, as well as resilience, ecology, and also quite a few interested in public access and wayfinding, just to name a few. So that's really helpful for us to kind of understand some of the things that y'all are coming in with, so that we can make sure that we're keeping an eye on them as we move forward. All right, I'll stop sharing.
So I'll now hand it over to Matthew, who will present some of our findings from our infrastructure and flood risk needs, as well as sector-specific opportunities.
Thank you, Teskina and Zoe. Since we last met, we've been working in more detail on the economic analysis, as well as studying the flood risks in the harbor. We've gone into considerable detail in some of these analyses, and we can't share all of our findings here tonight. There isn't quite enough time, but we are going to do our best to really summarize some of the important takeaways that we're reaching at the moment. This diagram is a reminder a little bit about how our process is working. We start at the bottom, where we're looking at economic trends, infrastructure, and resilience related to flooding, which brings us to the second layer, where we begin to establish goals and strategies. The issues with greater specificity in each of our planning areas, which are listed there, each of which has their own particular characteristics, uses, plot configurations, relationship to the harbor, and upland uses, for example. And then as a reminder, there are two outcomes of this planning process in a way. One is a set of recommendations and actions for economic development specifically. And you'll see in the upper right, this includes things like fundraising, financing, building capacity, and like. And then the other is the regulatory plan, which is really the formal municipal harbor and designated port area plans, which ultimately are regulatory documents used to guide the development and to use in the harbor and provide guidance for licensing projects within Chapter 91 jurisdiction. And may also include some recommendations for changes to the city zoning code if that's required to align with the objectives of the plan. Next slide. This is a map of our various sub areas. This provides us a way to consider portions of the harbor separately based on their current characteristics. Some portions of these are not technically within the jurisdiction of Chapter 91, but as adjacent upland areas still play an important role in the maritime economy. And this is a way for us, for planning purposes, to help sort of organize priority areas and figure out really where different approaches might be more appropriate. Next slide. So infrastructure and flood impacts. We've looked pretty carefully at some of the projections and some of the flooding that's already occurred in Gloucester. And we're starting with an example of recent flooding. This was a couple of years ago. the harbor master, really to demonstrate that challenges related to increased flooding are here already, and really not just a thing of the future. In this case, a winter storm coincided with a high tide and broached the seawall in front of the harbor master's offices. That's all it took was, half a foot, 3 inches, and suddenly it is a very sort of different equation. Next slide. This map is showing the current flood risk area in the harbor, which is currently defined by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agencies. Their boundaries are based on historical flooding, and typically do not incorporate anticipated sea level rise or greater frequency of storms or that sort of thing. It's important to note that already you can see there are a number of businesses, pretty much all of the businesses within our planning area, and some important infrastructure in the city are sort of already impacted by this flooding potential. Next slide. And as we look to 2050, we see increased flood risks, less in the extent of the flooding and really more in terms of the depth of the water and the frequency of those storm events. This map models the extent and the depth of flooding in 2050 and assumes approximately 2.5 feet of sea level rise by that time, which is on the higher side of the current estimates, but well within the range, plus a 100-year storm. And to clarify, a 100-year storm is a storm of an intensity that really has about a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. It doesn't mean that we won't see one for another 100 years. It means that they're at that sort of 1% level of rarity, but we are seeing more and more of them. And they are anticipated to occur more frequently. And I think we should all note, particularly the vulnerability of the Harbor Cove area, which reaches pretty well into the landmass there. Next slide. So that was a map of sea level rise plus a storm. This is really just baseline projection map showing the levels of high tides over time. And so at present, you'll see outlined in the green line, including both mean high water and mean higher high water. There's a blue line for 2030, orange for 2050, and red for 2070. You'll see that that again, like the previous map, that once we move into 2050, things change pretty quickly, particularly in the Harbor Cove area, where a lot of that landmass becomes subjected to high tide flooding. Next slide. And many businesses, as I mentioned, are already below even the current requirements for FEMA. And I won't go into all the detail of this chart, but if you look on the right-hand side, it's sort of ranked from baseline Gloucester Harbor to current nuisance flooding to future nuisance flooding to current flood events. And if you look at that zone, you'll see that there are many businesses that are kind of at that elevation. Any new construction would be required by FEMA to be higher at that dashed line above it at an elevation of about approximately 15. And so we're already dealing with a lot of businesses that are, in some cases and in some moments, literally underwater. And so it's a real challenge to get from some of these lower elevations of about 11 or so up to 15. That's quite a difference. Next slide. And broadly, in a working port where businesses rely on their proximity to the water, this presents a challenge, both in terms of the operations of those businesses, but also in terms of navigating code requirements to meet those FEMA requirements. This will require greater financial and technical support for the adaptation of existing facilities. For instance, dry flood proofing may not be feasible operationally, but there are wet flood proofing approaches that might allow existing businesses to become more resilient. In addition, the city will need to continue to protect its infrastructure, such as the water pollution control facility and the major roadways that support all of the businesses in the harbor. And another issue that should be mentioned is that this is a 10-year plan. It's not a 30 or a 50-year plan, but the flood threats are much longer term. And so I think one of the things that we want to address as we move forward is how we can identify what can be done short term, how those things can be implemented over time, and what items might be longer term in terms of adaptation. Next slide.
Great, so I will go ahead and launch this poll. This is really just to understand a little bit more about, what you think we can do to respond to this, these resilience questions, and also to understand a little bit about your personal kind of risk threshold, how you think about these risks and kind of where you'd need to see kind of these resilience risks come into play in order for you to make sort of different decisions about investment in your life and with the properties that you are interacting with. So I will go ahead and launch this poll. So the first question is, what kind of actions to increase resilience do you think would have the biggest impact on ensuring Gloucester's water-dependent businesses can survive, thrive, and compete in the global market? This is really about the businesses on Gloucester's harbor and kind of thinking about what kinds of supports or investments would help those businesses continue to be competitive, stable, healthy, given these resilience concerns. And again, like Rick had mentioned on the previous one, you can scroll down to see all the options and to see the next question. The second question is really about your own personal kind of risk thresholds, asking what frequency of flood damage and loss would make you likely to take a substantial action, such as moving or selling, elevating, or flood proofing your home or business. And for the first question, we're asking that you choose one. And for the second, you can choose multiple. Just about half of you have responded. We'll give a little bit more time. And understanding this is really important for a harbor like Gloucester, where so much of the land is privately held. It's really individual decisions that kind of add up to something greater. So understanding kind of the mix of approaches and attitudes towards these issues is really helpful for us in sort of planning for the harbor as a whole. We're at about 70%, a little bit more time. It looks like we're plateauing a little bit, so I'll go ahead and close it out in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I'll share it back so you guys can all see how people responded. So for the first question about sort of ways to increase resilience of Gloucester's water-dependent businesses, the response that had the most interest was financial support to implement flood risk adaptation, for example, wet flood proofing. And then there was a pretty consistent interest sort of for a second tier in the truck access road infrastructure and water pollution control facility, so the public infrastructure. And then the next one was sort of technical assistance to support business and property owners. For the second question, around sort of what frequency would sort of trigger action for you, there's a big jump for daily, monthly, once a year, and once every few years. Those all had a lot of response, and then trailing off for 10 years, 20, 30, 50. And there's a couple of you that have would not take such a measure regardless of the frequency. Great, thank you for that.
Okay. I will start to summarize our approach to the economic findings and the sector-specific findings. We've organized our analysis to align with the Blue Economy Report that was conducted under the leadership of UMass and several state and local partners, both for the state as a whole and the North Shore. The various sectors of marine-related economic activity are sorted into 6 categories that you'll see here: living resources, offshore minerals, marine construction, transportation, ship and boat building, and coastal tourism and recreation. Using these categories really allows us to break down the various parts of economic activity and give us a basis to compare them to the North Shore and the state as a whole. It should be noted here that the first 5, which are outlined in a dashed line, represent water-dependent uses that are actually allowed within a designated port area. They are, for the most part, marine industrial uses. Tourism and recreational uses are generally not allowed in a DPA, particularly as a primary use, although there are exceptions and conditions in which some aspect of that might be permitted. Next slide. And it should be noted that when we discuss blue tech and R&D, such as the GMGI, which is the Gloucester Marine Genomics Institute, that these types of uses fall into all of these different sectors. So they kind of cut across all of those. So I just wanted to make that clarification, that as we talk about R&D and those kinds of things, that they really kind of apply across a number of these different sectors. Next slide. So Gloucester's economy has performed well over the last several years, with job and wage growth across several sectors. The core maritime economy represents over 2,100 jobs and over $100 million in wages. As a percentage, that's approximately the same as in 2013. It's important to note that seafood, fishing, and fleet-related services represent about 2/3 of the overall blue economy wages in Gloucester, which is a lot. And I think it underscores the continuing importance of the sector to the overall economy, alongside, obviously, the marine education advocacy research, and as well as tourism, which is also not insignificant. Next slide. With this analysis, what we're really trying to understand is how the marine-related economy, how it relates to the overall economy and the economic kind of ecosystem of the city. And so we think of it not just as work that or activity that takes place just along the coastline, but as a kind of food chain, if you will, that goes all the way from the marine environment through the coastal into the upland. And I think as we continue to look at the economy, look at opportunities for growth, looking at ways of strengthening some of the core marine dependent uses in the city, that we need to think of these things holistically within the larger context of both an upland and a marine economy. Next slide. So the greatest near-term opportunities really are in living resources and tourism. Offshore minerals are really not terribly applicable in Gloucester. And if you go to the next slide, with respect to marine construction, transportation, and ship and boat building, while there might be some applicability for Gloucester, these typically require much larger areas of land. So for instance, Salem and New Bedford, that are two cities with designated port areas that are sort of getting into the offshore wind support business, are really working with much larger parcels on the order of 25 acres or 40 acres, which are the kinds of parcels you need to support offshore wind. Gloucester is unique in the kind of in how small and intimate the parcels are, which is really one of its strengths, particularly as moving to very independent sort of smaller lobstering and other kinds of operations. But it places limitations on some of these other kinds of uses that require large laydown areas. I will hand it off to Zoe to speak in a little bit more detail about some of the other economic things.
Great, thanks, Matthew. So first, just as kind of an aside or a note for anybody who really wants to delve into the detail of this economic baseline work, there is a much more detailed presentation from sort of the end of the summer that goes into a lot more detail on all of these, but we wanted to give you all a real kind of an overview of the key findings for each of these. So to start with, for living resources, which is really kind of the traditional base of Gloucester's blue economy, this encompasses everything from harvesting finfish and shellfish and kelp to the processing of those materials or those creatures that have been harvested. And so that, results in everything from, food, sort of direct to table, to fish byproducts, biopharma and biomaterials, as well as additives. And, while some of these may sound sort of abstract or high tech, they actually pretty much all of them have a presence in Gloucester already, with the exception of additives. So this is sort of a pretty expansive field, even though it's sort of rooted in some pretty recognizable traditional fields. Next slide. So in starting this work, one of our key questions was just to understand what's changed since the last harbor plan. And so for living resources, one of the biggest changes is that we've seen a big shift or a swing from the finfish that sort of historically has been at the core of the harvest for Gloucester, to increasingly more lobster operations. And so this has, all sorts of ripple effects in terms of operations and sort of configuration of the harbor, and represents an interesting just sort of business evolution for Gloucester. We've also seen that there have been several significant closures of seafood processing facilities locally in Gloucester. And on the positive side of things, that Gloucester Fresh was launched during that time period to market and promote local fishing and shell fishing operations. And it's seen some success, but there's certainly opportunities to sort of scale it and sort of see ways of growing the impact. So with that, we dove into some of the sort of nitty gritty of the current conditions. And there's kind of, broadly speaking, three takeaways for living resources. One is that Gloucester still has a strong base. The fishing activity is sort of competitive with and exceeding, in a lot of cases, both sort of peer New England ports as well as the US fishing industry as a whole. And Gloucester continues to be one of the top 10 to 15 seafood processing locations in the country. that's measured in terms of employees and wages. And that that represents, that's a significant, win. That's a positive for Gloucester, because there's been certainly a litany of changes and shifts that are difficult to navigate. And so that represents sort of the grit and resilience of the fishing industry here in Gloucester. On the flip side, Gloucester is absolutely still, dealing with, some significant transitions, one of which is what I'd mentioned previously, of that shift from large scale ground fishing to increasingly lobstering and small scale operations that have a higher per pound value, but maybe have a different physical imprint on the harbor. Additionally, the seafood processing industry at a national level is consolidating and shrinking employment in a lot of cases, which is obviously manifesting in Gloucester in certain ways as well. As a counterbalance, the wholesale market is actually expanding. So there's a little bit of push-pull there. So you can imagine that's a lot of change to navigate as a small business owner in Gloucester. And in particular, on top of that, the slim margins and unpredictability of the fishing industry is really can constrain people's ability to invest strategically in their business going forward. And so that's another thing that we kind of flagged as something to kind of keep an eye on, see if we can develop some solutions that might kind of help the really active business owners out here in Gloucester. Next slide. So with that, some of the opportunities that we've highlighted, as well as needs, these kind of cross both sort of the harvesting operations as well as the seafood processing, because there's certainly an interrelationship there. One is that the harbor infrastructure itself may need to adapt over time as the fishing market shifts to smaller operations, different species. That many harvesting operations need to find ways to capture more value from their work, which in a lot of cases means exploring seafood processing, as well as some other opportunities to kind of capture that value added sort of increased profit opportunity for their product. With that in mind, given the challenges that more traditional seafood processing operations have had in Gloucester, looking at the potential for a more hybrid model that crosses seafood processing with seafood wholesale to kind of counteract some of that consolidation and shrinking within the seafood processing industry. This is no small feat. It would require a lot of planning, but it's something that we wanted to explore a bit. And then finally, with those things in mind, looking at different processing technologies, as well as the potential for shared harbor infrastructure that might be able to help Gloucester navigate the changing kind of standards and, in some cases, geographic location of seafood processing facilities that sort of are plugged into the harvesting network in Gloucester. Next slide. So with that, we want to kind of turn back to you and share kind of two ideas that we have for ways that Gloucester-based harvesting operations could capture more value from fishing and shellfishing. And these are not intended to be mutually exclusive, but more so, two different ideas that could be pursued in tandem or separately, or just one or just the other. So I will enable the chat feature so that you can share any additional ideas, and I will go ahead and launch the next poll. So this poll is pretty simple. It corresponds to kind of what's on the slide currently. The first idea is the 100% fish strategy. That's really about utilizing more of the fish than the market might make use of and pay for otherwise. So encouraging things like using byproducts of the fish for fertilizer, things like that. And then the seafood co-op is really a concept for kind of shared ownership and equity, and sort of building a system that's able to deliver more of that value added benefit back to the harvesters themselves, so that there is a direct connection between locally harvested product and the entity that is doing the processing, the marketing, the distribution of those products. And this is something that's been successful all over. For instance, there's a successful one in Martha's Vineyard, as well as in Washington, the Seafood Producers Cooperative. And in the poll, you're welcome to check all that apply. So if you feel like both of these are worth pursuing, worth exploring for Gloucester, you can check both. If you have other ideas you'd like to share, you can share those in the chat. And if you think that none of these are a good match for Gloucester, you can also let us know that. Okay, we're at about halfway, so I'll give people some more time. I know it's a lot to digest at once. Okay, looks like we're plateauing a little bit, so I'll go ahead and close out in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And the poll and share it back to you all so you can see where we landed. So about 70% of y'all thought that both were worth looking into, the 100% fish strategy as well as a seafood co-op. And I see in the chat that we had a note that this is already being done with Neptune's Harvest, so maybe a potential to sort of scale or look at that as a sort of a pilot. And that there's potentially that higher catch quotas and marketing of underutilized species might be able to contribute as well. Great, and I'll stop sharing. And jump into the next slide. So the next sector that we wanted to kind of explore with you all is tourism and recreation. And this is, as Matthew had noted, it is generally speaking not allowed by right in the designated port area. And so this sort of requires a really careful consideration of how it's contributing to the sort of economy overall, and sort of trading that off with impacts on the water dependent industrial uses that are sort of prioritized for this area. So just for context, this is a significant industry in Massachusetts. It is seasonal to some extent. Summer tourism represents a big portion of it. And historic and educational related tourism is a big driver. And that for Gloucester in particular, there is a significant concentration of the whale watching businesses in the Northeast, as well as an active charter fishing base. And so there is a certain sort of relationship that exists already, between tourism and the active water dependent industrial uses. So what's changed since 2014? We've seen a growth in charter fishing, particularly for tuna, which has in turn created demand for dock space. There's been sort of new tourism anchors that have come online, in particular Beauport Hotel, for instance. Discover Gloucester was formalized. This is a destination marketing organization to promote Gloucester. And there's also been some really sort of dedicated planning around the relationship between downtown and the industrial waterfront. Next slide. So some of the important things to note about tourism in Gloucester is that it's highly seasonal. So it's really anchored around the summer season. And that it has a sort of a regional anchor. So a lot of visitors are coming predominantly from the areas north of the Mass Pike, and that it's sort of an anchor within the North Shore trade area, so including Salem, Beverly, Manchester by the Sea. And the last thing is, like, I think at the core of this is that the harbor is absolutely part of the visitor experience. It's not kind of separate and apart from it. In looking at visitor itineraries, they're very much blending, things that are rooted in the downtown with, more harbor oriented and sort of industrial working waterfront oriented experiences. So our core question is sort of interrelated, which is, how can we leverage this sort of this industry of the tourism and recreation industry as an economic engine for the harbor in a way that doesn't undermine or sort of set back the marine industrial uses that are really the sort of the priority for this limited land area. And just really explore, are there any creative ways that can really help to finance the needs of those water dependent industrial uses. So really thinking about them in close relationship with one another. Next slide. So similar to the last time, I'll just kind of walk you through some of the initial ideas that we've had and get your thoughts on whether you think they're a good fit for Gloucester, whether you think they're worth pursuing. So these are all designed to kind of get at how that sort of tourism industry tourism and recreation can really be economic engines for the harbor without doing sort of damage to the industrial waterfront businesses. So the first idea is exploring working waterfront visitor program partnerships. So this would be looking at ways to kind of integrate things like factory tours, seafood processing and wholesale operations into sort of unique visitor programs that might really support and celebrate the working waterfront. So people who are looking for a slightly more non-traditional like experience of the working waterfront. This has been really successful elsewhere. For instance, Honolulu, New Bedford, as a way to kind of connect that tourism industry back into the wholesale and industrial businesses along the waterfront. Another idea is really more physically oriented. So looking at wayfinding, which is really just sort of helping people navigate, interpretive signage, things like that, coupled with sort of focused physical improvements in sidewalks, crosswalks, and beautification along kind of dedicated loops that we know visitors are already making use of. This is, for instance, you could think of Boston's Freedom Trail as an example of this, where you're really kind of crafting a specific route and controlling people's deviances from that route to some extent to manage this experience in a way that sort of handles the trade-off. And then the last idea is really about the seasonality. So it's about extending the tourism season beyond the summer peak, so that the economy gets a more steady benefit from it locally. So I will go ahead and enable the chat again and launch the next poll. So similar to the last one, you can check all that apply. These things are not mutually exclusive with one another. So the first is the idea of working waterfront program partnerships. The second is the more physical focus on wayfinding and pedestrian routes. And the third is really about time of year. So programs that might be able to attract people to come to Gloucester, to sort of have experiences in Gloucester outside of the summer peak season. A little bit above halfway, so give people a little bit more time. And same as before, if you have other ideas, feel free to drop them in the chat. We're able to see all of them. We'll incorporate them to our next step. Okay, Looks like we have plateaued a little bit, so I will go ahead and close out in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I will share back so you can all see. Looks like of the 3 kind of ideas that we had shared, the one with the most interest was the first. That's the Working Waterfront Visitor Program Partnerships. Then also an interest in the shoulder season extension programming, and a little bit less interest in the more physical improvements of wayfinding and pedestrian routes. Also in the chat, we had a couple of people share ideas from other cities and around the ferry and different ways of sort of bringing in cultural and civic functions to complement the tourism routes that people have already taken part in. So I will stop sharing. And jump to the next one. Okay, so the next topic is sort of going back to what Matthew had shared earlier. Blue Tech and R&D really is cuts across all of the different sectors. So you can think of it as kind of a next step within each of those. So it touches a lot of different aspects. So everything from marine life science research and development like GMGI, to more kind of digital and electronic equipment that has a marine sort of function. And in particular for the digital and electronic component, this is really a growing sector nationally, sort of both in terms of ocean observation and autonomous undersea vehicles and remote operated vehicles. And because of Gloucester's sort of position in the region and proximity to both Boston and a series of well-established research and educational institutions, there's really a lot of opportunity for Gloucester to sort of position itself in this space. And there's already kind of anchor activities. Good. So obviously one of the biggest things that's changed since 2014 is the establishment of the GMGI facility, and sort of that as an anchor to the sort of opportunities for Blue Tech in Gloucester, sort of as a proof of concept and something that certainly makes the city more appealing for other similar operations and business concepts. Some of the key findings in our analysis of the current conditions, one is that the technological change that we're seeing across sort of other sectors is certainly playing out in the blue economy as well. So electrification of engines and powertrains, smart tech, things like tracking and cold chain requirements in distribution chains, supply chains. These are really things that Gloucester's already interacting with. And so getting ahead of that and sort of having a handle on to what degree and in what ways Gloucester wants to incorporate that into local businesses will really help to sort of navigate the changes that are occurring nationally and internationally. And then the other sort of piece of it is more thinking physically that, as these things are making progress in Gloucester, they also have different physical needs than the traditional fishing sector, sort of living resources sector. So they have different dimensional needs, they have different electronic needs, and they have different sort of worker expectations and worker relationships. So that's something to kind of keep in mind in terms of, what and where. So in terms of opportunities and needs, we're looking at, opportunities to build capacity as well as, physically, where could this be located within Gloucester where it would sort of benefit the harbor. Next slide. So similar to the last, these are sort of 3 ideas. One is looking at expanding the presence of institutional research in Gloucester. The second is sort of more of an incubator or launch pad for ocean innovation and development businesses and concepts. something like that has existing infrastructure in place to support that kind of exploration. And then the third is looking at opportunities for Gloucester to serve as a deployment center for marine construction and monitoring. So this would be really taking advantage of the physical location to argue for having that deployment occur from Gloucester. So I will do the same thing, enable the chat and launch the poll here. So same as before, these are not mutually exclusive. Feel free to check all that you think are worth pursuing or exploring in Gloucester. And certainly if you have any other ideas, feel free to share that in the chat as well. And I'll give you all some time to digest and make your decisions. We're a little over halfway, a little bit more time. Okay, a pretty good percentage. So I'll give people a little bit more time. Just do a little countdown here. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, thanks so much. And I will share back to you. So it seems like of the ideas that we shared, there was the most interest in expanding the presence of institutional research, followed by looking at ocean innovation and development space, and a little bit less interest in the idea of Gloucester being a deployment center for marine construction and monitoring. Looking at the chat here, an interest in also looking at sort of workforce development and kind of talent pipeline as part of this sort of mix here. And looking at, whether there's an opportunity to attract conferences and sort of increase the sort of visibility of Gloucester as a hub for these kind of questions. A couple of mentions of I4C2 as a place where we could maybe explore some of these ideas. Great. All right, I will stop sharing the poll, and we have just one more of this sort of sequence here. So as we kind of think about, some of these more specific, sector-specific ideas, a lot of them sort of cycle back to some bigger picture or cross-cutting things that that sort of would enable action on these different ideas. So in particular, thinking about building capacity, attracting resources, looking at recruitment, marketing, technical assistance, things that sort of help businesses act on ideas that they have and help businesses attract the resources that they need to implement those ideas. And then also, to some extent, aligning sort of regulatory and planning frameworks so that they can really be a cohesive roadmap for how to navigate all of these different interacting policies and regulations. So some of the big things that have changed since 2014, sort of relative to those sort of 3 themes sort of listed on the left. There has been a Port Maintenance and Improvement Fund was created, and a Harbor CBC was created. There's still a sort of an opportunity for a bigger impact or sort of a larger scale solution in those arenas. And With time, we've also seen, for obvious reasons, infrastructure has continued to deteriorate in the absence of larger scale investment or capital to help with those that maintenance need. And so there's, as we're now looking at some of these resilience issues, and also looking to kind of, longer planning horizon, understanding, what could be done to facilitate these kinds of bigger picture needs is sort of an important thing for this planning process to touch on, even if it's not the primary sort of end result of this planning process. Next slide. So there's three sort of ideas that we wanted to share with you on this topic of building capacity. So our question is sort of, which of these ideas do you think has the potential to build local capacity to execute these kinds of ideas that we've shared throughout this presentation? So things like business development, promoting innovation, driving marketing, conducting recruitment at a scale necessary to actually move the needle and have an impact on sort of the needs of Gloucester Harbor. So the first idea here is a nonprofit structure. So a nonprofit development corporation that would have, these all kind of would have a similar function, but a different structure. So they would have the capacity to acquire select marine infrastructure and properties that are really critical for the harbor, drive investment in buildings, support grant writing, and find the sort of sources of capital for renovating and sort of investing in the marine infrastructure that's necessary for these businesses to do well. A different approach would be to do a port authority. So that's more of a public sector approach. This has been used in Alaska and New Bedford. And then finally, looking at opportunities to increase municipal staff and board or committee capacity to do kind of the same set of things. So I will go ahead and enable the chat and launch our last poll here. So same as before, these are not, necessarily mutually exclusive. If you think they're all worth exploring, that's still helpful feedback for us. If there's one that you think is a really bad idea, don't select it. And if you have any other ideas of what you think would really help to provide that foundation of sort of support for these, navigating these changes and opportunities in the harbor, feel free to share it in the chat. And after we kind of conclude this poll, we'll share just a little bit about next steps, and then we'll transition into a more kind of open format question and answer period to really dive into anything that you felt throughout this presentation that you needed a little bit more clarity on, or you wanted some more detail, or just if you have a comment to share that about the content that we presented today. And again, like Taskina had mentioned at the beginning, please do be mindful of other people's time and sort of take one question at a time so that others have the opportunity to ask their questions as well. So I'll keep this open for just a few more moments. Do a little countdown to 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'll share it back. So there was the most interest in a nonprofit structure to do these, accomplish these tasks. And then a sort of a similar level of interest in both the Port Authority and a sort of municipal capacity solution for these needs. And in the chat, there was an interest in sort of exploring potential sort of hybrid models, or being more specific about who and what expertise is needed in each of these positions. right, I will stop sharing. You can jump to the next slide, Taskina. Great. So for next steps, we're really pivoting from some of this more in-depth economic analysis to thinking more about the regulatory response to those economic needs, and also about the physical sort of constraints and opportunities. So looking at those sub areas more specifically to understand what the opportunities and constraints are for each of them and how the regulatory plan can best support the needs of those different sub areas. In terms of meetings and outreach, we have our next Harbor Plan Committee meeting. And then our next public meeting will be to share draft plan recommendations for feedback. And in the interim, we welcome you to go to the social pinpoint map, which you can access through the website, as well as the comment form available there, to share anything that's on your mind, anything you think we should be focusing on, anything that you felt was missing. And in general, continue to go back to the website to get the latest information, and just stay connected to the process as it evolves. Okay, so with that, I'll hand back to Matthew to facilitate the Q&A.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you everyone for staying with us and answering the polls. There's already been some very substantive kind of comments and questions that have gone back and forth. We want to reserve this time for maybe more open-ended questions or just other kinds of comments. I will act as the air traffic controller. And if a question is better answered by someone else, I'll pick someone else on our consultant team or the city or whoever I think is most appropriate. But we welcome any questions or comments.
It looks like we have a couple folks who have raised hands. I can go ahead and let them in order share their comments with the group. So looks like we have Robert Gordon. So Robert, you should now be able to speak. Go
Okay.
ahead and unmute.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Rob Gordon, Gloucester resident. Excellent presentation. Lots of really neat ideas. Really sort of some out of the box innovative thinking. My question is, and I'm sure you guys have some of this in the detail, is scary stuff, scary maps on sea level rise that I know many of us have seen before. How do you bridge sort of that gap between the massive cost of rebuilding infrastructure and mitigating the impact of sea level rise to some of the the exciting initiatives? There's a big number somewhere in the middle just to take care of what will be impacted, the going concerns, businesses, infrastructure, et cetera. So the aspirational stuff that we talked about is really neat, but how does that gap sort of get closed between what we're going to need to do just to keep the city going as sea level rise happens and has to be mitigated relative to some of the new exciting stuff that's on the drawing board?
I think that's a good question. I'm going to answer preliminarily, and then I might call on Kevin Hively to see if he has any follow-up to that. But I think with regard to the resilience, experience tells us that it's incremental. There is money out there in the world, in the state, the federal level to support flood protection measures. But it's a question about crafting a plan that looks over a time horizon and looks at the weak points, the inundation points, and an analysis of where the city gets its best bang for its buck and where adaptation comes at the private level or the public level. And Kevin, you may be able to go into that in a little bit more detail.
Thanks, Matthew. Sorry if I sound a little scratchy. I'm in Southern Virginia, and they've decided to have spring here. And so I'm getting hit with my first pollen bout today. What I think it speaks to is related to some of the capacity building, organizational building things that were discussed in the presentation about the need to have and create expertise that can help bring in capital or look at innovative financing techniques to help support redevelopment or shoring up of existing infrastructure and buildings in the region. And there's just literally no other way to do it. It's going to take money, and it's going to require finding resources, at the state level and at the federal level, and being creative through public-private partnerships to execute and protect against the sea level rise issues that are coming.
Thanks.
Okay, so I will go ahead and switch to our next folk with their hand raised. So that will be, I think, LJ Rigsby.
Hi, thank you so much. This was really interesting. I'm a Ward 2 resident, and I frequent the areas around the harbor regularly for different purposes. I'm also a business owner on Main Street, and I wanted to, I guess this is a question about climate resolution and resiliency, sorry. But I feel like we're kind of looking at it from like the land, looking out to the water, and there's so many really innovative things, projects happening around the world with dam building and barriers. And even in Venice, there's the MOSE project, there's inflatable, there's technology happening now to protect harbors. And I think that we're an excellent potential case study for sort of the more emerging technology. Even in Manhattan, they're starting to look at barriers, and we're looking at it from the land perspective. And I'm wondering if you've talked about the potential of barriers for Gloucester as an innovative solution. Thank you. That's my question.
That's a good question. I'm going to direct it to Nasser. If that's okay, Nasser.
I'll jump in ahead of Nasser. How about that?
Go for it.
Because we did work on a project together. Our 2015 climate action and resilience plan did kind of start to lead towards the idea of what is the scale of approach going to be. There potentially are macro scale solutions. They could be potentially costly. And that's, from a municipality's perspective, so far, we have really tried to focus on municipal infrastructure with more project-based floodproofing of critical infrastructure. I don't know, Nasser, you could probably put a number on it in terms of the hundreds of millions of dollars answer to the question of whether or not, that's the approach. So it's definitely something that's out there in terms of, there may be approaches to do that because the shoreline protection at this point, as has been pointed out, is predominantly, a private property issue right now. And I think it does appear from the state level, in certain ways, there may be ways to partner on infrastructure for protection. But lurking in the background is is this harbor set up for an appropriate, more macro scale solution? And again, funding would be the number one issue with that discussion.
Thank you. Am I still unmuted?
Yep, we can still hear you.
Oh, okay. Because I understand that we have a lot of private ownership within our harbor, but we're also, we have federal and state, we're sort of protected or designated as a working port. So it seems to me that it's like the perfect storm in a positive way that we have state, federal, local, and private options to look at maybe more innovative solutions outside of our port to protect the sea level from coming in. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, LJ. So our next speaker is Suzanne Altenberger. So Suzanne, we should now be able to hear you if you want to unmute yourself.
I'm sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you for all doing this work. It's important. It's America's oldest fishing port, America's oldest seaport. And since we've been in the business of designing boats since 1952, about 70 years now, we would always emphasize the need for a modern fleet. And I think it's been emphasized to the consulting group at Utili with about 20 some PDFs, how important that future project should actually be, not just under COP20 Glasgow Agreement on lowering our global carbon, but in general to give our fishing fleet a fighting chance to at long last enter the 21st century. Because as of 1994, March 1st, our fishing fleet was frozen in time due to federal regulation to not innovate to a level where our fishing members that are fishing fleet drivers, our fishermen who are on this panel, Mark Ring, Vito Gigalone, and so on, and that those folks have never had a chance to find 21st century boat in this port active. So they don't know how to experience it, don't know what it looks like, don't know what the numbers would be. And so one of the major issues seems to be in any harbor planning in the 21st century to focus on the fact that a port without a fleet is just an empty cove. So when we have Gloucester with a fleet stuck in the early 1990s, late 1980s, actually, there's no modern boat in this town. Even one built yesterday, launched this morning, will be to the principles allowed by federal code as of March 1st, 1994. Anybody who cares to look this up, look for CFR 651. Dense 42,000 words on that Tuesday of that regulation. A port without a modern fleet simply is pointless. So I would urge these harbor planners here to perhaps consider hiring outside help to focus on what the fleet structure needs to look like. Without a modern fleet, you've got no port, and without a plausible fleet structure, why should tourists come here? I would urge them to stay away because this is just going to be a very sad spectacle. On the other hand, of course, we did bring the US Navy to town over 10 years ago. We did build a 39-foot long patrol boat for them in full public view. 1,160 folks looked at the project. There was broad interest by parents to see whether their kids could partake in that boat building project. And of course, we had to turn most people away. So I think there's opportunities here in town. We've proven the point we can do this work, but for some reason, when I hear Matthew Littell speak of laydown space, we've got plenty of room in this town to build up to 180-foot long fishing boats, if anybody wants that, or research vessels, or pleasure boats, or national defense project, as we did already demonstrate with the 39-footer, just a modest first Navy project, but it was successfully concluded and lives happily today in civilian hands in Rhode Island. She's alive and well. So I would propose that you folks take the fleet angle very seriously. And finally, we need to bring the next generation along. An ocean-centric mindset, an I4C2 should be marine industrial vocational technical training facility, a vocational technical school where people learn everything related to boat building, machinery, hydraulics, electronics, electrics, ground tackle, safety gear, everything, and of course, fishing. Different kinds of fishing. And as long as we don't, have a straight backbone and say, we're interested in the next generation, 21st century, and we want to be a viable port. America's oldest fishing port should be amongst America's smartest ports. And so far, it looks like we're not going to be. And I think we should be, and I think we can be, and you can certainly count on this office's help. We keep pushing on every level, including broader presence of our argumentation along I4C2 as well on the web. So I look forward to some collaboration on your end. And I hope you folks take us up on this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. Okay, our next speaker is Valerie Nelson. Hey, Valerie, you should be able to unmute and speak.
I unmuted. Yeah, thank you. I'd like to just return to the climate adaptation issue and just mention, and I guess my question would be, are you formally including this, and particularly Kevin? I attended the last harbor plan meeting where I was really quite impressed with a couple of angles on this. One was, correct me if I'm wrong, Vito, but that there seemed to be some consensus around the fact that the fishing industry businesses are always going to have to be on the waterfront. And they'll find a way to do this. But moreover, what I heard Vito saying was there's some of the most flexible businesses in terms of continuously, incrementally raising the heights of the loading docks and stuff like that. And the floors of the, the cutting or processing. So I thought that point was really quite important in terms of adaptation, at looking at the kinds of businesses that are the most flexible, need to be on the waterfront. And those are the ones that are most adaptable to climate change. So I hope you include really strongly what I heard Vito say. The second comment I heard was from Tony Gross, and who raised the question about, I guess in regard to I4C2, but I think in the climate adaptation field, there's a growing sense of looking seriously at managed retreat and relocation. And when does it become cost prohibitive to try to keep staying and occupying every single inch of the coastline? And what I heard Tony say was, that I thought was quite interesting, is that, the steel wall and the soils there are, just a lot of problems with I4C2. And is it a worthwhile expenditure to put hard structures there that we know will be in trouble, or begin to look from a climate perspective at wetlands, stormwater absorption, or simply accepting the need that we can't preserve every square inch of property. Possibly there are open space uses temporarily in the interim. So there are nuances to the whole climate adaptation. Kevin, I hope you got all the record of that, because I found that the committee members had really interesting things to say that I thought were major parts of a climate adaptation strategy for the waterfront. And I hope that I didn't represent Vito or Tony what I heard you say. I thought it was really quite interesting and important.
There's many aspects to that comment and slash question. And I think you're right that when it comes to questions of investment versus retreat, there's, as you are implying, economics is certainly at play. I know, I don't know if either Nasser, Greg, or Kevin might have anything to add to that. I know that, for instance, there was a kind of a disposition process for I4C2, which revealed some of the underlying complexities and expense of just getting it ready for development. But
I guess,
Matthew, this is Kevin. I would just say, Valerie, I think your points are very well taken. And, I totally agree with the other members of the committee in terms of the issue around flexibility. I mean, I think one of the determining factors here going forward for some of this is the cost of building in resilience and what the insurance companies say, and what the insurance companies are going to require as it relates to not only property and casualty loss, but business operation disruption, which is sometimes of an even bigger number, frankly, than property loss. So there's going to be some very, very interesting issues that are going to have to be confronted going forward.
All right. Thank you so much, Valerie. I think we have one more. Moment. We have Deborah. Okay, Deborah, you should be able to unmute and speak.
Okay, Deborah Ellison, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. I've been listening to these meetings from the very beginning, and it's very, very interesting information and a lot of very helpful information. With regard to Harbor Cove, I've heard the committee members at various times talk about 4 themes or goals for Harbor Cove, such as tying it to the downtown harbor to help increase the vitality of both the harbor as well as downtown, attract people to Gloucester and encourage year-round activity, maintain and greatly enhance the public access to the harbor, and means of funding and maintaining and improving our marine infrastructure and developing new marine infrastructure. The proposals that seem to be discussed, however, don't seem to do that. And I would encourage the committee to be flexible in what you're looking at and think of other uses that may help to promote those goals, so to speak, because I think that they're very important goals, particularly for the area that is close to downtown. One idea that had been floated and has not really been discussed is the civic center and a potential civic center. And that would meet all of those goals. It would tie things, it would tie the harbor to downtown. It would attract people to Gloucester all through the seasons. And it would maintain public access, and it would also provide a fund on surplus tickets tax to fund the infrastructure. So I guess my only comment is just to encourage you not to restrict this harbor plan so that innovative solutions are left out of the discussion. Thank you.
I just thank you for that comment. And I will add that I think one of the arts of municipal harbor plan is maintaining the right balance of identifying priorities, but also leaving the door open to innovative or interesting uses. So thank you for that.
Great. Looks like we have one more. Their hand raised, Marcia Hart. Okay. Should be allowed to speak now if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Hi, this is Marcia Hart from Gloucester. I'm calling in from Iceland, where it is 12:35. I've been to all these meetings because of how important they are, and I've also participated in other harbor plans that have been held in Gloucester. I'd like to thank you for the process, and I'd especially like to thank Vito and Tony and Tessa for bringing some more reality to the conversation that was initiated by the consultants in terms of the real consistent and continuing value of our fishing industry and everything that's attached to it. I was impressed by the numbers, and they were even more impressive than I thought they would be. And I was already impressed by those industries as having a distinct and unique and important value to the community, but also to the economy of the city. And it's not talked about in the city to the extent that it should, considering the value that exists there. So a lot of conversation is stilted because it does not include the reality of that contribution to all of us. In the chat, I wrote that fishing and charter and whale watches are like the goose, and tourism is like the egg. So of course you want this valuable egg. It's a great egg, but the last thing you want to do is kill the goose to get that egg, because you can have both. We have always had both. That is our history. Fishing has been a core, and it's been disrupted, and it's been damaged, and people have continued. And the same with tourism. I enjoy that we are a city with tourism. It provides me opportunities that are reasonably priced, that I'm able to take part in, that I might not otherwise. I enjoy seeing people come to Gloucester from other places. I love going other places. And so I really like to have tourism in Gloucester. I always had, and I've lived in Gloucester 45 years, but I'm feeling like it's at a capacity that needs to be carefully managed. I think what's needed is balance between our various industries. So rather than cannibalizing each other, they continue to be synergistic. And as somebody who no longer really enjoys going to my beloved Good Harbor Beach because it's so freaking crowded, I have always loved the middle of September until it gets really nasty in January. And then when it gets nice again, a few days in March, maybe a week in April, and then glorious in May. I am so happy that we have Gloucester back as our community in those months that are still nice, but it's not really crowded. It's not full of tourists. It's my town. It's your town. It's our town. And we can have both, but please, with the idea of shoulder seasons, don't make it so the only month of the year that there aren't a lot of people in Gloucester besides us is January, because it's a miserable time of year. And so is February, and so is most of March. So I would really be careful of what you do to the residents who live here with your marketing and tourism, which can destroy something of value to all the 30,000 citizens who put up with that miserable part of the year so that they can have that golden shouldered season to themselves. I don't know what else I can say. I thank you for listening to me. I love Gloucester. I appreciate all of you being on this committee and participating in your work. Oh, and I4C2, oh my God, it is the only city-owned property of any size. What are we saying about our city if what we put there on our marine industrial harbor is a performance center? Please don't do that. That does not belong there. It would be great somewhere else. I'd love the symphony to be in Gloucester again. I would love performances. I don't want it on the Marine Industrial Harbor. Put it on Main Street where it helps the Main Street businesses. And maybe you should think about using I4C2. If you can't come up with a marine industrial idea, use it as a sponge, because the city is going to be inundated with water and you are going to need buffers. And that's something the city owns, and it can use it for the good of all of the businesses around it and behind it. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcia.
Thank you.
All right, looks like we have one more person who hasn't spoken yet. Patty Page. Patty, you should be able to speak now.
Hi, good evening. Patty Page. I represent Mortal Island Lobster, 60 Commercial Street, for those of you that don't know me. If there's going to be flexibility for a civic center at I4C2, that's not flexibility, that's a hole in the program. We all know about special public destination facilities. We've presented a wonderful Harbor Masters building where recreational boats are welcome now. We have that spot in our DPA. If that's the kind of regulatory flexibility that we have, which I'm not sure legally, I listened to Attorney Ellison and appreciate her position here, but she spoke about goals. She didn't speak about the law. So we need to, if the state and the city, through DPA and Marine Industrial Regulations, Chapter 91, are going to provide that kind of use, I say we look at the rest of the harbor and find out what our real goals here are. There's been a lot of connections to downtown. I'm very familiar with the LRRP plan, which I'm glad was mentioned here tonight. It's actually on the Harbor Plan website, the data and analysis part of that, not the final report. And there are some projects in there that need to be looked at. I think that they're in direct conflict with the Harbor Plan. There's a TDM, a tourism destination marketing district coming in. I think it's really important that the Harbor Plan Committee be fully briefed on that, what it includes, what it doesn't include, and make sure that that's not a conflict with the waterfront. The waterfront is one of the districts in the LRRP plan. So there's some clarification that needs to be done here, and we really need to look at this because we're all about tourism as the byproduct to the fishing industry, the fishing port that this is. But the balance seems to be really tipping. So let's be very careful. And I appreciate everybody's time here. Thank you.
Thank you.
I wasn't going to talk.
Great. Thank you so much. All right. So I think that's, we've heard from everybody so far. And I think we've covered a lot of ground in terms of the different sort of tensions and opportunities and risks or threats to the harbor. So I think if everyone else is okay with it, we might kind of wind down here and invite you all to continue to share your thoughts, your concerns, your opinions about what should happen in the harbor through the harbor planning website. We really appreciate your time and participation today. And it'll really help us to sort of take our next steps. If anybody else wants to offer any other concluding comments.
I would just say generally, thank you very much for the substantive participation. These are really terrific comments. There was a lot of material, and I feel like we got some very good feedback both along the way during our polling and in the Q&A. And I encourage you all to stay involved, and as issues or questions come up, that you continue to participate through the website.
And thank you again, Matthew and Zoe, for leading a very productive meeting. I think we captured a lot of touch points, certainly some strong takeaways, at least in a metrics that can be discerned and discussed in the future. And I think that it was much easier to follow and participate than former iterations. So I don't know if there are any other Harbor Planning Committee members like to make a comment before we sign off, but I was encouraged by this evening's meetings and the level of participation. There are none. Do we need a motion to close, Greg?
I think you can have a motion to adjourn, and I think if you had one word. Whoa. Wow. If you had, I just wanted to say, if you had one word to take away from this, it's certainly balance. And I think I am just so appreciative of the members that we have on the committee, and I think we have exactly that in the makeup of our committee. So I'm very confident that what comes out of this process will be the best thing that it can be for Gloucester. So there's been a motion to adjourn by Member Gross. A second?
Second.
Okay, and a roll call vote. Member Noonan?
Yes.
Member Bal?
Yes.
Member Brown?
Yes.
Member Catone?
Yes.
Still on? Yep, he is. Member Gigaloni?
Yes.
Member Gross?
Yes. And thank you, everyone.
And Member McCarthy.
Yes.
Okay, have a great evening.
Thanks, John.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.